critical thinking on current issues. This is Undercurrent. I'm Gabe Lyons, and I'm so thankful that you're joining with me, not only for today, but for a series of conversations and episodes that I'm creating, all meant to help us think well about our current cultural moment. You know, for 20 years, a lot of my work has been trying to help Christians, especially leaders, stay curious about the world, always asking questions, being inquisitive, but then to think well about it, to be informed, to ask good questions, to understand the complexities of the debates and dialogues around so many of these issues, but then finally to advance good, to do something with it, to make sure that we're taking the truth that we understand and the wisdom that we've been able to cultivate, and we're taking it forward into a world to help people who have a lot of questions, who might be confused amidst the chaos. And I would say for most of us, I think there's a clear understanding that in the world today, there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of chaos. I think many would agree that the acceleration of cultural change is happening at a rate that few of us would have ever experienced in our life up until this moment. And now we find ourselves in the middle of that acceleration asking much bigger questions. What's happening here? How do I think clearly about this? How do I operate in peace, not in anxiety or fear? How do I move forward and lead those that are in my care, whether it's my children, it's friends, a community, maybe it's a church, a business, an organization, something that God's asked you to steward? And so I hope that as we go through this season of Undercurrent, that you find this as a place that helps challenge you to think well, to be informed, to take in the information that you can trust. We're in a time where we don't know who to trust anymore. We're not sure we can trust our government leaders. We're not sure we can trust our media. We're not sure we can even trust the church. And so in the midst of that, there's a lot of room for people to get confused, to get isolated, to get misinformed. And so we want to take the time to work through thinking more deeply about a lot of these different topics and issues. And so in this first episode, I want to frame for us how we might approach and think about the culture today and what our role as Christians is in the midst of this changing culture. How do we see a vision for a future that's hopeful, that does bring life and flourishing to those around us? And how do we point out and expose the things that actually are meant to harm us, that are not for our good? They're not for our family's good, our children, our church, our community. And we need to be able to see those things and point them out clearly as well. And sometimes that's not always easy to do. And so there'll be times you disagree with something that I'm stating as my opinion or the way in which I'm seeing it, and that's okay. I've always loved to cultivate environments where we're okay challenging each other and asking these big questions and approaching it with a sense of humility that we don't have all the answers. We're doing our best to see, but it's many times we're looking through a glass that's cloudy and dim, and we don't always see things in the full light. And so we'll do our best to explore that, but we'll explore it with humility. And so as I invite you into this, I want to ask you to do that with me. And then I want to ask you also to think about who are the other people in your community that by having conversations about some of these matters would encourage them, would help them not feel so isolated, would help them to feel it's okay to ask some questions about the moment that we're in. And so we're going to explore today a concept I like to call how to build the parallel. Now, what I mean by parallel, I'll explain in just a moment, but I believe this is the moment that we're in a moment where there's two different visions of the future, and we need to choose which vision we are going to be a part of, and how do we lead others to be a part of that with us. No matter where you're leading, no matter what you've been called to do as a parent, as a mom, as a school teacher, as a pastor, as an entrepreneur, as a filmmaker, as a tech entrepreneur, whatever it might be that you've been called to do, I want to submit to you that you've been called to build a parallel structure right now in a world that desperately needs it and is longing for it and is looking for leadership. I think of a book that I've always enjoyed by Charles Dickens called A Tale of Two Cities. And in this book, I love the way that he begins because he essentially states for us in a poetic form a lot of where I see our environment being. I'm going to read it to you here right out of chapter 1. It says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way." Here, Charles Dickens is painting this picture of two different worlds, people living in the same age, in the same city, in the same moment, and yet two different perceptions of what was happening around them. Two different visions of reality, two different ways of experiencing life in the midst of this world. And I think that's where we're at today. We're in a moment where there are these two different visions. And the more we can understand the two visions that are moving forward, the more we can make a choice about which one of these structures are we going to participate in? Are we going to build? Are we going to continue to contribute to with our time, our energy, our effort, our imagination? And it's exciting. To me, it's exciting to get clarity on the deception and also on what is true. And so as we move into that, I want to talk about that first future. And that first future I would define as man as machine. Okay, capture that essence. Man is a machine. That's the vision. That's the vision that we're all being pulled into. It's the vision that's being talked about. It's being celebrated. It's a vision that, though, is not necessarily new. It's not something that others before us didn't see coming. In fact, some of the most trusted people that you love to read were talking about this. I mean, think about C.S. Lewis, his book, The Abolition of Man. Look at how he says this. He reads, "For the power of man to make himself what he pleases means the power of some men to make other men what they please." So in The Abolition of Man, he's speaking to this future where man is slowly going to be abolished. And how is that going to happen? Well, it's going to happen through a series of technologies, a series of ways of thinking about a human being that starts to remove the divine. And he goes on to say this, the process which, if not checked, will abolish man. Traditional values are to be debunked, and mankind to be cut out into some fresh shape at the will of some few lucky people in one lucky generation which has learned how to do it. You see, we're in a moment like that where there are actually those who are learning how to do it. And we talk about this through thinking about genetics, CRISPR, the way in which biotechnology is advancing at such a rapid pace. I think of artificial intelligence and so many of these advances that are innovative, that are interesting, that many of us are being pulled into. They're being celebrated as some of the latest advances in how human beings are going to move forward in the world. And yet it all lives off of an ideology that essentially is this, that we can perfect biology. It's this vision that if we could just perfect, if we could tinker with our bodies, if we could tinker with our systems just enough, we could perfect them. And there are people that are putting this vision forward. In fact, I want you to hear one of them, Yuval Noah Harari. He writes about this in his book, Sapiens, and he defines for us what he sees as a future vision of the world. And I want you to just hear it, though, in his own words about how he would describe for us this idea of perfecting biology, this ideology that's driving a lot of this man as machine thinking. Let's listen to this.
When Yuval Noah Harari published his first book, Sapiens, in 2014, about the history of the human species, it became a global bestseller and turned the little-known Israeli history professor into one of the most popular writers and thinkers on the planet. Yuval Noah Harari is talking about the race to develop artificial intelligence, as well as other technologies like gene editing that could one day enable parents to create smarter or more attractive children, and brain-computer interfaces that could result in human-machine hybrids.
What is biometric data?
It's data about what's happening inside my body. What we have seen so far, it's corporations and governments collecting data about where we go, who we meet, what movies we watch. The next phase is the surveillance going under our skin.
Under our skin. I mean, listen to that. Surveillance going under our skin. This is 60 Minutes. You're hearing this. This is a public discourse. This is a conversation about the future of humanity. And it's based on this idea that man is a machine. And if we can perfect man's biology, then we would all be better. The human race would be better. We would live longer. We would live healthier lives. It's all built on a vision towards a view of humanity that's not on the correct foundation. And so how does one get to this place? Well, it's essentially a vision that doesn't have a soul to it. It's where the eugenics movement came in. When we look back over the last century and we see how much eugenics, the idea of trying to tinker with biology and genetics to create the perfect human being, that whole idea is based off this idea that we as man have the ability to create human beings in our own image. When we start to take that step of hubris, when we start to move into that sense of pride about what we can create and how it can be much better than what God could have ever created, we start to move into a new phase where we start to eliminate the divine. So you have the ideology of perfecting biology, but the emotion that's being used is fear. You see, fear is what starts to drive people towards this future. Fear of the other, fear of people that don't look like them or act like them or think like them, fear of a future that if we don't make these advances, you're surely to die. You see, some of these sounds and some of these phrases are things humanity's lived with for years, but we're finally at a moment where more and more people are susceptible, are listening. Media has more of a voice into their lives. Every day there's streams of content and information and influencers and social media feeds that are telling people, be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. Let's listen to this.
Children and young adults said they expect climate change to have major implications for how they live. That's on top of growing research that shows young people are increasingly experiencing what's now known as climate anxiety.
Los Angeles is dealing with a spike in brazen and sometimes deadly robberies.
It's here now, and it's spreading, and it's going to increase. For unvaccinated, we are looking at a winter of severe illness and death for unvaccinated. For themselves, their families, and the hospital they'll soon overwhelm.
You see, you listen to things like that, and you're like, yeah, I tend to hear that kind of information all the time. But if you can understand what's happening, there's always fear. There's fear of something many times that's unseen. Things like climate change, things like a virus, things that you can't necessarily put your hands on, but are used to promote fear that actually push us to a place to where we're looking for a savior. We need rescued. We need someone. We need somebody in authority, someone that's an expert to tell us how we ought to live so that we can stave off this fear. Well, there's many who've written about this type of psychology. It's a psychology and it's a tool that oftentimes has been used to manipulate, has been used to move populations. I think of a book called The Rape of the Mind, written in 1956 by Joost Meerloo. Here's what he describes. Logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot. It confuses those who think straight. The big lie and monotonously repeated nonsense have more emotional appeal than logic and reason. While the people are still searching for a reasonable counterargument in the first lie, the totalitarians can assault them with another. I mean, think about that. One fear is put in front of you, and then you're assaulted with another one. You can't catch up mentally. You can't resolve the first thing, and then there's a new thing upon us, a new crisis that must be dealt with. And whether that's war in Europe, whether it's a virus that's spreading, whether it's economic breakdown and crash, whether it's climate change, whatever it is, there seems to always be a new crisis that we can't quite resolve. That puts us in a state as human beings as psychologically vulnerable and manipulatable. And so throughout history, there's story after story of leaders who've taken advantage of that kind of mentality to build their structure, to start to push us towards a vision for the future that they think is best for humanity, even when it doesn't necessarily align with God's view for the future of humanity. And finally, the structure that leads this man-as-machine ideology is coercive control. You see, control starts to become a big feature of this structure. It's the only way to actually get it done. And we start to move into a phase where controls are needing to be put in place so that we can all live in this vision without necessarily the freedom to opt out. Listen now to how some world leaders are talking about that future.
And what we're seeing in the world today, I think, is we are on the brink of a dramatic change where we are about to, and I'll say this boldly, we're about to abandon the traditional system of money and accounting and introduce a new one. And the new one, the new accounting, is what we call blockchain. It means digital. It means having a almost perfect record of every single transaction that happens in the economy, which will give us far greater clarity over what's going on. It also raises huge dangers in terms of the balance of power between states and citizens. In my opinion, we're going to need a digital constitution of human rights if we're going to have digital money. But also, this new money will be sovereign in nature. Most people think that digital money is crypto and private. But what I see are superpowers introducing digital currency. The Chinese were the first. The US is on the brink, I think, of moving in the same direction. The Europeans have committed to that.
You see, this vision of a future of coercive control obviously involves economic rules and new ways in which we can transact. So you see this description, this was a year ago, of central bank digital currency. It was starting to be put forward. Well, now we're at a moment where in July, this will be rolled out in the US. It'll be tested. It'll be the beginning of a digital currency. Leaders of the World Economic Forum have talked often about the Great Reset. You've probably heard that phrase, this idea that we need to reset the way in which the rules work for our economy and our finances. Well, one of the ways to do that is through currency, creating digital currency that can be tracked. Every transaction you do can be tracked. if you're not supposed to buy something, you're not going to be allowed to buy something. So how will this be done? Well, the central bank digital currency vision is designed to create digital currency that maps literally every transaction that you can do. And many in China have talked about how this type of currency has been what has positioned them to have a social credit system. If you're not familiar with that, we'll talk more about this in future episodes. But the idea that they're building a technocracy that starts to control every action, track it, with our phones being a key tool to do that. This is the kind of environment that starts to work its way in to start to advance a vision for humanity that whether you align with it or not, you find yourself susceptible to, you find yourself sitting in the middle of. Now, people have often written about this, and sometimes I find it so helpful for us to look back at these ideas and where they've shown up in history. I want to read you a quote about totalitarianism from Hannah Arendt. She says this: "A totalitarian society is one in which an ideology seeks to displace all prior traditions and institutions with the goal of bringing all aspects of society under control of that ideology. A totalitarian state is one that aspires to nothing less than defining and controlling reality. Truth is whatever the rulers decide it is." You see, Hannah Arendt is giving us this vision that whatever's been working in the past needs to be replaced. We need a new system because there's no way controls can work when you're working with free people who have individual choice and free will and the ability to make decisions however they want or transact however they want, to buy and sell whatever they want. In that kind of a system, you don't have control if you're one of the leaders who's wanting more control. And so this man as machine vision goes forward with technology, it goes forward with surveillance, it goes forward with ideologies that are pressed in on people, it goes forward with censorship, it goes forward with things that we now can all appreciate are happening around us. But man as machine is that vision. Now, I want to be careful as we talk about this because it can be easy to try to ascribe motives to leaders who might be part of these new advances. And I think in many cases, it's hard to do that. We don't always know the motives. All we can do is look at the actions. We can try to understand and estimate what's happening and historically, how has this happened before? And we find that human beings often go through this cycle where people gain power and control and they want to control more people. That's a historic fact that we've seen that rhythm throughout all of time. I even think of Stalin, who thought starving millions of Ukrainians was a battle with demons. I mean, he thought he was doing something good, but what he was doing was murdering and killing people. You see, we're in that same situation today. There's death. There's lives being lost. And sometimes they're being lost on this altar of a future of humanity that other leaders, other people who believe in perfecting biology or believe that man is a machine and we need to make a better machine are driving us to the brink of truly disaster for humankind. And when I think about our moment, I think about the church being a parallel structure. If you're part of a church, if you lead a church, if you volunteer at a church, if you just participate in a church, you see, we're called to be these little embassies. These churches represent an embassy of the kingdom of God. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different way of viewing the world. It sees through the ways in which the enemy would like to control and enslave and tell human beings how they must live, how they must function, versus the freedom that's created in the body of Christ to say, no, we actually serve a different king. And in fact, we're going to be governed by the way in which our king teaches us to live and what is best not only for us and our families, but for our communities and for all of humanity so that humanity flourishes. And so as I look to this future, as I look at the season that we're in this moment, it's incumbent upon the church right now to lead, to have the type of energy to say, we're going to build the parallel. We're going to be a parallel society. We're going to be very careful about how much we're participating in some of the systems that the world wants to put in place to control humanity, to observe humanity, to use technology at every turn because it's convenient. And yet it's in that convenience that we actually start to give up and surrender some of that control. And so the church is at a critical point right now to ask some of these bigger questions. And I can promise you, we're all asking them. We know that 71% of Americans believe that our country has grown more authoritarian in recent years. 71%, 7 out of 10 of people, if you're a pastor sitting in your congregation, if you're in a neighborhood of your neighbors, believe that this type of structure of control, this structure is moving in. And this ideology that man is a machine literally removes the dignity of human life. It actually starts to look at human beings as numbers. It looks at us as useless eaters in some case. If we have a disabled child like I do, that they would say as a vision of man as machine, if this machine isn't producing, if it's not productive, if it's not helping our society move forward, then it's in the way and it needs to be eliminated. And we start to see that pop up in all kinds of social issues, whether it's euthanasia, where there's a move to kill off people who are getting older, or now as it's advancing in Canada, it's advanced as well in the UK, where you're starting to see people who are actually perfectly healthy, but given the choice to kill themselves because they would just rather not be here and medically have that assisted. You see, this is the dark moment that we're walking through. So what is it going to mean for us as the church, as brothers and sisters in Christ, to step up, to offer value, to say, no, human beings have value. We don't actually allow other human beings to kill human beings. We don't assist people in ending their life because we know that we respect God's design and that He knows the day and the hour. He knows the minutes. He knows the days. They're numbered. And so we're going to trust Him with that. We're not going to take that into our own hands. And so the spirit of the age would want to control, but the spirit of freedom that Christ brings, of liberty, starts to help us as Christians re-envision a way in which He may want us to show up in this structure. So the next episode, we're going to get into what does it mean to build the parallel that operates in a countercultural way against this vision of man as machine. And I want to invite other people into this conversation with you. Listen back to this with friends and have a conversation about how you're seeing some of these ideologies show up in your world, in your work, in your technology, in the way in which you're living your life. Maybe not realizing, maybe being a bit naive to the facts that control is coming all around you, from your economic decisions to where you live, to how you live, to the decisions you're given freedom to make and the free will to choose. And so the more we can start to see that and we can expose it, it gives us hope. It gives us a sense to go, oh, wait, maybe there's a better way. And so in this next episode, we'll get into the better way. What is God's way of thinking about humankind and flourishing in the midst of this moment, in the midst of a moment where there's lots of chaos and confusion? And so we're going to continue to go underneath the current issues and think more deeply about that together. And I'm so excited that you've joined me to do it. I hope this first episode's encouraging you that there's a lot of deeper looks we need to take on what's happening in the moment. But I want you to have hope, and that's where we're going. Episode 2, episode 3, 4, 5. You're going to continue to see how to think well about the moment that we're in and how we can do it together. Now, to share this episode and the subsequent episodes to come, you can go to GabeLyons.com/undercurrent, where all of these episodes can be viewed and watched. You can also share these on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to podcasts, so that people that follow you on social media, you can share with them. You can also see more on my social media at Gabe Lyons on Twitter as well as Instagram. As always, to dig deeper into what's discussed today, check out our show notes and you can find helpful links to more information that'll help you go even deeper into the stories that we're discussing.